The wedding bells rang across the stone courtyard, but no one celebrated. Silk banners hung from the castle walls. Torches flickered in the cold wind. Nobles gathered in careful silence, their eyes shifting between the bride and the soldiers guarding every gate. This was not a wedding born of love. It was a treaty. A young princess stood at the center of the hall, dressed in a gown of deep crimson velvet. Gold embroidery ran along the sleeves, the colors of her homeland. Yet beneath the beauty of the dress, her hands trembled slightly. Across the hall stood the man she was about to marry, the enemy king. Only months earlier, his armies had marched through her father's lands.
Village burned.
Castles surrendered. The war had ended not with victory, but with surrender. And now peace had a price. Her royal marriages had always been tools of diplomacy in medieval Europe. Alliances between kingdoms were often sealed not with ink, but with a bride. Daughters of kings were raised knowing that one day they might be sent far away to marry a stranger for the sake of their kingdom. But this marriage felt different, because the man waiting at the altar had once been her father's greatest enemy. The princess had never met him before the war. She had only heard stories, tales whispered in court halls of a ruthless ruler who expanded his borders through battle and intimidation. Some said he was brilliant, others said he was merciless. And now she was about to become his queen. The negotiations that led to this moment had taken weeks. Messengers rode back and forth between courts. Advisors debated every detail of the treaty. Land would change hands. Prisoners would be released. Trade routes would reopen. But the final condition was the most important. The princess would marry the conqueror. To the defeated king, her father, this marriage meant survival for his people. Without it, the war might begin again. But for the princess, it meant leaving everything behind. Her home, her language, her family, and possibly her freedom. When she first heard the decision, the court chamber had fallen silent. No one asked her opinion. Royal daughters rarely had that luxury. Instead, preparations began immediately.
Tailor stitched wedding gowns.
Priests prepared the ceremony. Guards escorted the princess under heavy protection toward the enemy's capital. The journey itself had felt like crossing into another world. Villages along the road still showed scars from the war. Burned barns, broken walls, fields left untended. Each mile carried her further from the life she had known, and closer to the man she barely understood. Now, standing in the great hall of the enemy castle, she felt every watching eye upon her. Some nobles studied her with curiosity, others with suspicion. To them, she was not just a bride. She was the daughter of a defeated king, a symbol of surrender. The enemy king stepped forward slowly. He wore armor beneath a dark ceremonial cloak, as if reminding everyone in the room exactly how this alliance had been forged. Not through diplomacy, through war. For a moment, the hall fell completely silent. The princess lifted her gaze and met his eyes for the first time. There was no warmth there, only calculation. This marriage would end a war, but it would begin something far more complicated. Because inside the walls of the conqueror's court, the princess would discover that survival required more than obedience. It required strength, and sometimes quiet rebellion. But she did not know that yet. All she knew was that the priest had begun to speak, and the fate of two kingdoms was about to be sealed with a single vow. The castle gates closed behind her with a deep, echoing thud. For the first time since the wedding ceremony, the princess realized something unsettling. There was no road back. The enemy capital was unlike the palace she had grown up in. Her father's court had been smaller, quieter, filled with familiar faces and long traditions. This place felt colder, larger, stranger. The corridors stretched endlessly, built from dark stone that seemed to swallow the light of the torches along the walls. Guards stood at every archway, their armor reflecting the firelight as she passed. None of them bowed. None of them smiled. To them, she was not truly their queen. She was the daughter of a defeated king, a political promise wrapped in silk and jewels. Her chambers were grand but unfamiliar. Heavy curtains hung from tall windows, and tapestries depicting the enemy kingdom's victories covered the stone walls. Some of those victories had been won against her own people. The message was clear. She was living inside the conqueror's world now. The women assigned to serve her spoke in a language that was not her own. Though she understood parts of it, the words felt distant and sharp compared to the softer sounds of her homeland. Even simple conversations required effort. Even simple gestures carried risk. In royal courts, every movement mattered. Every word could become a rumor, and rumors could become weapons. The enemy king rarely visited her chambers in those first weeks. When he did appear, his presence filled the room with a quiet intensity. He did not speak much. Instead, he watched, studied, measured, as if trying to understand the woman who had suddenly become part of his court. During their first private dinner, the silence between them felt heavier than armor. Finally, he spoke. "You are far from home." The princess nodded slightly. "Yes. You do not seem afraid." The truth was far more complicated than that. Fear had followed her since the day the war ended. But fear alone would not help her survive here. So she answered carefully. "A queen who shows fear gives power to those who wish to use it." For a moment, the king simply watched her. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled faintly. "Perhaps my advisors underestimated you." That single sentence spread through the court faster than any royal decree. Within days, the whispers began. Some nobles believed the new queen might become a powerful ally to the king. Others saw something far more dangerous, a foreign influence, a reminder of the enemy kingdom they had fought so hard to defeat. In medieval courts, power rarely came from titles alone. It came from alliances, from trust, from survival. And the princess had none of those things yet. At royal feasts, conversations often stopped when she approached. Lords who once shouted across the hall suddenly spoke in quiet tones. Ladies watched her carefully, judging her clothes, her gestures, even the way she addressed the king. Every moment felt like walking across thin ice. But slowly, something began to change. The princess listened more than she spoke. She watched how the court worked, who advised the king, who feared him, who secretly disagreed with him. She learned the rhythms of this foreign kingdom the same way a traveler studies a new land. Quietly, patiently. One evening, during a council meeting, the king asked his advisors about trade routes through the mountains near her homeland. The generals argued for control through military forts. But the princess knew those mountains better than any of them. So she spoke. "If you send soldiers there, the villages will resist." The room fell silent. No one had invited her opinion, but she continued anyway. "If you send merchants instead, they will open the roads themselves." The king leaned back in his chair, considering her words. Some nobles looked outraged. Others looked intrigued. Finally, the king spoke. "Perhaps our queen understands those lands better than we do." From that moment forward, the court began to realize something important. The enemy princess had not come here simply as a symbol of peace. She had come with knowledge, and knowledge could become power. But power inside the conqueror's court was dangerous, because the more influence she gained, the more enemies she would make. The change inside the court was subtle at first, but the princess felt it immediately. Where once there had only been cold curiosity, there was now something else. Tension. Servants lingered a moment longer when she spoke. Courtiers watched carefully during council meetings. Even the king's advisors began studying her reactions when matters of war or diplomacy were discussed. Her single suggestion about the mountain trade routes had worked. Merchants reopened the passes. Villages welcomed trade instead of resisting soldiers. Within weeks, goods began flowing through lands that had been closed during the war. The king had noticed, and so had everyone else. But influence inside a royal court was like walking across a frozen lake. Each step forward risked breaking the surface beneath you. Soon the whispers began. At first they were quiet murmurs in shadowed corridors. "The foreign queen advises the king now. She speaks for the lands we conquered. Can the daughter of our enemy truly serve this kingdom?" Some nobles believed her knowledge was useful. Others believed it was dangerous. One evening, as the princess walked through the torchlit gallery leading to the chapel, she noticed two court ladies fall silent as she approached. Their conversation stopped too quickly. Their smiles were too polite. She had grown up in a royal court. She understood what that meant. Rumors had begun spreading. In medieval courts, rumors were never harmless. They were weapons sharpened in silence. The most powerful man openly opposed to her influence was Lord Varenk. He was one of the king's oldest generals, a man whose victories in battle had helped build the very kingdom she now ruled beside. Tall, stern, and respected by the army, Varenk believed power should come from strength, not diplomacy. And he made little effort to hide his dislike for the new queen. During council meetings, he often spoke after her suggestions. "If we follow the advice of someone raised among our enemies," he once said coldly, "we may soon forget who those enemies truly are." The room had fallen silent. All eyes turned toward the king. But the king simply watched both of them, studying, measuring. Finally he spoke. "Wars end, Lord Varenk." His voice remained calm. "Empires grow when former enemies become subjects, and subjects become loyal." The general bowed slightly, but the tension in his eyes remained. The princess realized something important that day. The king might tolerate her influence, but others in the court might not. And powerful men who disliked losing influence rarely remained quiet forever. Weeks later, a new rumor reached her chambers. A servant girl, pale with fear, whispered the news late at night. Some nobles believed the princess was secretly communicating with her father's kingdom, passing information, helping her homeland recover from defeat. It was a dangerous accusation. In medieval courts, suspicion of betrayal could destroy even the most powerful nobles. For a foreign queen, it could be deadly. The princess understood immediately what was happening. Someone was testing her, trying to weaken the trust between her and the king, trying to turn the court against her. The next day, she made a bold decision. Instead of hiding from the rumors, she walked directly into the king's war council. The room fell silent when she entered. Maps and letters lay scattered across the long table. The generals looked surprised. Lord Varenk looked almost satisfied, as if he had expected this moment. The princess stepped forward calmly. "My king," she said, "there are whispers in this court that I serve my father's kingdom." The king leaned back slowly. His eyes narrowed slightly. "And do you?" The room held its breath. For a moment, the fate of the foreign queen balanced on a single answer. But instead of fear, the princess felt something unexpected. Clarity. She lifted her head. "My father's kingdom surrendered." Her voice was steady. "I serve the future of the realm I now live in." Silence filled the chamber. The king studied her face carefully. Then slowly he smiled. But across the table, Lord Varenk's expression darkened. Because in that moment he understood something dangerous. The foreign bride he had hoped to remove from the court was not weak. She was learning how to survive, and perhaps, how to rule. After the council meeting, the tension inside the palace became impossible to ignore. The princess had spoken boldly in front of the king and his generals. She had defended herself without fear, and the king had publicly accepted her loyalty. But victories inside royal courts often created new enemies. Lord Varenk was not a man who easily accepted defeat. For years, he had been one of the king's most trusted commanders. His soldiers respected him. His victories in battle had expanded the kingdom's borders. Many nobles owed their lands and titles to the wars he had helped win. Now, suddenly, a foreign queen, the daughter of a defeated enemy, had begun influencing the king's decisions. To Varenk, it was more than an insult. It was a threat. The whispers in the court slowly changed tone. At first, they had questioned the queen's loyalty. Now they questioned her intentions. Some nobles began repeating a dangerous idea, that the queen was quietly weakening the kingdom by encouraging diplomacy instead of military control. "Merchants instead of soldiers," one lord said during a private gathering. "That is how enemies regain strength." Another noble nodded. "And when they are strong again, war returns." These conversations spread quietly through the halls of the castle. Meanwhile, the queen continued watching, listening, learning. She had begun to understand something about this court. Power did not always come from the throne. Sometimes it came from the shadows surrounding it. One evening, while walking through the palace gardens, she noticed two guards speaking in hushed voices near the stone wall. When they saw her approaching, they suddenly fell silent and stepped aside. Their reaction was too quick, too careful. Later that night, one of her most loyal servants brought troubling news. A group of nobles had begun meeting secretly in one of the older towers of the castle, a place rarely used except for storage. Among them was Lord Varenk. The princess felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Secret meetings among powerful nobles rarely meant anything good, especially not for a foreign queen. Over the next few days, the court appeared calm on the surface. Feasts continued. Advisors debated policies. Musicians played in the great hall. But beneath that calm surface, something darker was forming. One afternoon, the king left the capital with part of his army to inspect the northern borders of the kingdom. It was a routine journey, one he had taken many times before. But the moment he departed, the balance of power inside the palace shifted. Without the king present, his generals and nobles held far more influence. And some of them had been waiting for exactly that moment. 2 nights later, a messenger arrived at the Queen's chambers carrying an official document. It bore the seal of the royal council. Inside was a formal request. The Queen was to appear before a gathering of nobles to answer accusations regarding her influence over the king's decisions. The wording was polite, but the message was clear. They were putting her on trial. The princess understood immediately what this meant. If the council declared her a threat to the kingdom, they could imprison her. Or worse, in medieval courts, queens had been accused of treason before. Some had lost their crowns. Some had lost their lives. The great hall filled with nobles the next evening. Torches burned brightly along the stone walls. Lords in heavy cloaks stood in clusters, whispering quietly. At the center of the chamber stood Lord Varenk. Waiting, the queen entered slowly, her head held high despite the danger surrounding her. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching every step. This moment had been carefully planned. Varenk stepped forward. His voice echoed across the hall. "Your Majesty," he said calmly, "tonight we ask only one question." He paused, letting the silence grow heavier. "Whose kingdom do you truly serve?" The entire court held its breath, because the answer to that question could decide her fate. And the king was still days away from returning. The great hall was silent. Torches burned along the high stone walls, their light flickering across the faces of the nobles gathered inside. Heavy shadows stretched across the floor like dark fingers pointing toward the center of the room. And in the center stood the queen, alone. Across from her stood Lord Varenk and several powerful nobles of the court. Their cloaks carried the symbols of the kingdom's oldest families. Men whose influence had shaped the realm long before the war that brought the foreign princess into their world. Varenk's question still hung in the air. "Whose kingdom do you truly serve?" For a moment no one moved. The queen understood the trap laid before her. If she defended her father's homeland, the nobles would call her disloyal. If she spoke only of this kingdom, they would accuse her of pretending loyalty. Either way, they hoped to break her. But she had spent months learning the rhythms of this court.